Morning, everybody. I thought I'd try something different here and use Screencastify to go through the reading with you. Foreign Affairs Unit 6, Lesson 7. We're talking about two things today, mainly the Monroe Doctrine and the Texas Revolution. Now, as we get into Lesson 8, it'll be a little bit confusing because there's a lot of similarities to the Mexican-American War and the Texas Revolution. But today we're just going to talk about the Texas Revolution. Learning objective is understand the role perspective, which we already talked about, plays with Monroe Doctrine and the Texas Revolution. So this is actually right from your textbook. Obviously, you don't have your textbooks with you. But the section on Monroe Doctrine says this. In Latin America, several countries had successfully fought for their independence from Spain and Portugal. Some European monarchies planned to help Spain and Portugal regain their colonies, hoping to keep the urge to revolt from reaching Europe. U.S. leaders feared that if this happened, their own government would be in danger. Russian colonies in the Pacific Northwest also concerned Americans. The Russians entered Alaska in 1784. By 1812, their trading post reached almost to San Francisco. In December 1823, President Monroe issued a statement that became known as the Monroe Doctrine. Monroe said that the Americas were closed for further colonization. He also warned that European efforts to reestablish colonies would be considered dangerous to our peace and safety. Finally, he promised that the United States would stay out of European affairs. The Monroe Doctrine showed that the United States saw itself as a world power and protector of Latin America. All right, so that'll be the only big part I read to you. But President Monroe, he was the fifth president. Okay, so he's the one after James Madison. But he did actually write this. This is mostly given credit to John Quincy Adams, John Adams' son, who then later becomes the sixth president. And if I were in class and drew a map or had the world map pulled down, I would sort of basically say that it almost made a wall along through the Atlantic Ocean. The idea that the Western Hemisphere, where we are, the North and South America, that's off limits now to European intervention. And actually, it was quite successful. When you look at colonization, Europe turned their attention to continents like Australia and Asia, and of course Africa. And as far as Latin America goes, even though those places had that place had a rich history with Portuguese and Spanish development, that was now seen as America's domain. When we talk about Latin America, it's essentially not perfectly, but everything like south of Texas and Arizona and California, New Mexico, that would be considered Latin America. Not all those countries, but the vast majority of them. But the part, again, going back to the idea of perspective, the part that would have concerned citizens of other countries, especially Mexico, is this bottom part here, right? That the Monroe Doctrine showed that the United States saw itself as a world power and protector of Latin America. And there's some truth to that, right? In the past 200 years, we haven't had a lot of invasions in the Western Hemisphere. However, as soon as that sort of relationship is spoken about, already you have a power dynamic, right? I mean, if somebody came up to you and said, "Don't worry, I'll be your protector," well, there might be safety and comfort in that, but there's also an establishment of somebody being up here and somebody being down here when someone is your protector. So that's why the Monroe Doctrine, again, depending upon your perspective, can have some different, it might elicit different emotions. Anyway, moving on from that, a little question there for you to answer. When you take a look at what the map looked like of the United States, and this is in 1830, so you can see that most of Louisiana Territory hasn't been made into states yet, but you can see that that was a gigantic chunk of land that was added. The Oregon Territory is actually still up for some confusion. That's not going to be settled until the president number 11, James Polk, comes along. But essentially, there was disagreement between the British Canada in the north and the Americans what that line would be. Thankfully, that was settled peacefully. But that's why this part up here is British Columbia now, and this part down here is Washington State and Oregon and Idaho. But you see this gigantic piece of land here. Well, all of this used to be part of Mexico. So you have a number of states there. Now, it doesn't all become the United States automatically. That's going to come in two waves, one of them being Well, it's actually three things technically. One of those being the Texas Revolution. Then there's something called Mexican Cession, and there's also something called the Gadsden Purchase. But just to show you the scope of, when you look at the lower 48, obviously Hawaii and Alaska aren't on here, that a gigantic piece of the country used to be part of Mexico, well into 1830. It's like, we've been around as a country for a while now, about 50 years. Moving on. Early stage of the Texas Revolution. Just the idea that this is from a book I read in college, actually, called A Different Mirror, that when Americans came into Mexico, which included places like Texas, that they didn't really, definitely didn't view themselves as Mexicans who were coming into a new country. They sort of kept their same American spirit, if I were to say that kindly. And one of the main sticking points was, pardon me, was the idea of slavery, because although slavery was not extinguished in America until 1865, full 35 years before that, the Mexican government had done away with it. So as we talked about, the cotton gin and how cotton cultivation spread across the South and into the Southwest. Well, Texas was a state where some thought cotton could be grown, but without slave labor, obviously that would cut into their profit margins. So many of the Americans were very upset that Mexico would dare ban slavery in their own country. But that is, again, a point of conflict. One person who's key to the Texas Revolution is this guy named Stephen F. Austin. So obviously, Austin, Texas is named after Stephen Austin. His father had this grand plan to bring people to Texas. His name was Moses Austin. But he died, I believe, in 1821, relatively young man. I think he died when he was 53 years old. And so it was sort of let to his son, Stephen, to finish the job. And you can do this reading on your own. But it talks about how Stephen Austin had to persuade the Mexican government for permission to settle in Texas, because Moses Austin had been given permission, but that permission had been granted via the Spanish government. But once Mexico gained its independence, it sort of had to start the ball rolling again. Although things like culture and religion were some of the demands of the Mexican government. Then you get into the section about the old 300, and I always thought this was a good quote, where Stephen Austin is sort of bragging about the safety of his new colony. He says, "You will be astonished to see all our houses with no other fastening than a wooden pin or a door latch." That's sort of like the 1820 version of saying that a neighborhood's so safe that you don't have to lock your doors. That's sort of what he's saying there. But one of the things that Stephen F. Austin really wanted to attract people to his the colony of Texas, again, part of Mexico, can't stress that enough, was he wanted slavery to continue. His own personal feelings were, well, he kind of knew that it was wrong, but didn't want to get rid of it, I guess, if I can summarize it. But he also thought that if slavery were to go away, then we'd end up with a country where freed blacks would be living alongside of whites. And he had several letters where he described the horror of that. So nice guy, Stephen F. Austin. Then we get into the timeline of the Texas Revolution. So again, I didn't want to just give you paragraphs and paragraphs of reading on this, but you can see that 1825, that's when the first of the old 300, these first of the 297 families settle in Texas. Then we have the outlawing of slavery. And before you know it, Texas is feeling less Mexican and more American as the numbers of Americans outnumber the Tejanos 6-1. Santa Anna, that's going to be a name that pops up not just now, but also in our next lesson. He takes over the presidency of Mexico. He'd been a general from a guy named Bustamante in 1832. 1835, General, I'm sure I'm going to mess up that name, but General Cos, he was actually Santa Anna's brother-in-law, and he arrives in Texas with the sole purpose of taking a cannon back from some Texas settlers. It had been given to this Texas village in order to keep them safe from Native American attacks. But seeing as things are not going well, Santa Anna decides that maybe they should take that cannon on back from them. So that goes with the Battle of Gonzales, which sort of kicks things off, although only 3 died, including an American who fell off his horse and died. We're also introduced to another person named Sam Houston. So, as you can imagine, Houston, Texas is named after him. They had given military control to Stephen Austin, but Stephen Austin had 0 military experience. So eventually it's made its way to Sam Houston. When Mexico finally does decide to send a relatively strong force of 6,000 men to Mexico, they have many difficulties. There's disease, bitter cold. You don't think of Texas being particularly cold, but they had actually people die of hypothermia. They had snowstorms where, like, inches of snow, like solid snowfall in the northern elevations of that area. Lack of pay. They had attacks from Comanche Native Americans. It was a disaster. March was a big month in 1836 for all of this. Something called the Battle of the Alamo, which perhaps you've heard of before. Mexican victory. People like David Bowie. Jim Bowie. Sorry, David Bowie is one of my favorite singers. Davy Crockett, that might be a name that you've heard. They have to do with the Alamo. Also, there's something called the Goliad Massacre. So, although these are really terrible things for the Texan side, right? Not the American side, but the Texan side. They end up being these rallying cries for the future. Also, in March of 1836, that was when the Texan Declaration of Independence was signed. So a lot happening in March of 1836. Soon thereafter, just the next month, there is a decisive American victory at San Jacinto. Sam Houston is there. Santa Anna is actually captured as he is trying to escape back to the main part of Mexico. So Texas, which had been a giant region of Mexico, gains its independence, and that's sort of where our story leaves her right now. Texas is its own country, and we'll talk more about Texas being its own country tomorrow. There are some questions here for you, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and so please answer those. Tomorrow we'll have some of the sources I used. Tomorrow we'll have a short quiz. Like we have, it'll just be on really lesson 6 and 7 on perspective, and then what we talked about here, and then I think I have a little Google map thing for you to Google Earth thing for you to do. As I said, I really did enjoy reading your responses to current events. That might be something we look into again on Monday. I guess it was just pleasant to see how many people were paying attention to what's going on in the world. And then for me to provide feedback that wasn't the same thing over and over again was kind of nice too. So if you turned it in on time, then chances are I provided some feedback and tried to engage you in a bit of conversation, made you think a little bit more. It certainly made me think some of the things you brought up. So again, good job with that. All right. Well, I will bye for now. And I will be in contact with you